This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 13 hours GMT on Wednesday the 24th of May. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, hundreds of soldiers are deployed across Britain and 3 more people are arrested following the suicide bomb attack at a concert in Manchester. It follows the Home Secretary's warning that further attacks may be attempted.
It was more sophisticated than some of the attacks we've seen before, and it seems likely, possible, that he wasn't doing this on his own.
We'll hear from our correspondent in Libya, where the bomber is believed to have just visited. And we accompany fans of the Manchester United team as they prepare for a match in Stockholm, another city that's been attacked by radical Islamists.
I feel guilty by being over there. I think I should be home with them, and they're not really close friends, it's associates, but it was a bad day for the world and a bad day for Manchester.
Also in the podcast, Taiwan's top court has ruled that same-sex marriage should be legalised, so will other countries in the region follow suit. We'll look at the meeting between Pope Francis and President Trump, 2 leaders with very different personalities and world views. Peace talks begin in Myanmar to try and end 5 decades of bitter conflict between the army and various rebel groups.
Only if they can get a peace agreement in place with all these different rebel groups will the Burmese army think about stepping back from politics here.
The President of the Philippines warns that martial law on the island of Mindanao, which has been imposed after clashes with Islamist militants, could last up to a year. And have scientists solved the puzzle of how flamingos manage to stand for long periods on one leg? But first, the British security services have continued their investigation into the suicide bombing of a concert venue in Manchester on Monday night, which killed 22 people and injured scores of others. And there's been a stronger police and army presence in major cities throughout the country in case further attacks are attempted. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, has said the ongoing investigation is trying to establish whether the suspected bomber, Salman Abedi, was acting alone.
It was more sophisticated than some of the attacks we've seen before, and it seems likely, possible, that he wasn't doing this on his own. So the intelligence services and the police are pursuing their leads in order to make sure that they get all the information and reduce, therefore, the risk that they need to keep us all safe.
As we record this podcast, 3 more people are being questioned by the police in connection with the Manchester attack. So are the authorities becoming more convinced that the bomber had help? A question for our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera.
That's right. I think that's the presumption that they're working on, particularly because of the relative sophistication of the device that was used. It makes it less likely that he could have constructed it on his own. So I think that is what has led to a lot of concern. Is there a bomb maker still out there, potentially a bomb factory? Does that mean there is a residual threat still? And that's why the UK threat level has gone up to critical, the highest level. It's not that they know for certain that there are others out there planning to carry out an attack, but they can't rule it out. And so on that basis, they've moved up the threat level.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, seemed to be concerned that foreign governments were publicising intelligence information because obviously knowledge is power, isn't it?
Well, this is particularly yesterday when the authorities had identified the attacker, Salman Abedi, but the name had not become public yet. But it started to emerge from US sources because it appears US law enforcement was briefed. Then someone in US law enforcement talked to their media. They published the name. And the police here and the security officials were not happy about that because effectively they wanted as much time as possible to continue with their investigation before that name was made public. And the British Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, did say that she'd made comments about that apparently to US officials because she'd been unhappy about that affecting the investigation.
And of course, hundreds of troops are being deployed across Britain now, aren't they, after the government warned about possible future attacks. We're not used to seeing soldiers at the Houses of Parliament or Buckingham Palace, huh?
No, that's right. The visible signs of being at critical threat level are there today. So the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, a big tourist draw, has been cancelled. No visitors allowed into the Houses of Parliament, only people with a pass. And yes, troops being deployed on the streets, something you don't see normally in the UK. They are going to be at places like, we think, Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, some foreign embassies, places where you'd normally see armed police. You'll now see the military, and the military will replace them, freeing up armed police to take on other duties.
That was Gordon Carrera, our security correspondent. And as we've been hearing, Salman Abedi's family comes originally from Libya. Our correspondent Quentin Somerville is there.
There are many conflicting reports that he may have visited here. Not only did he visit here, the French authorities say that he may also have travelled to Syria. We haven't had those confirmed yet. But what we do know is that plenty of Libyans have done that. Something like 3,500 Libyans travelled to Syria starting in about 2013, and very, very quickly they threw their lot in with the Islamic State. In fact, the Al-Batar Brigade, which was one of the most effective fighting forces, because remember, they'd been fighting against Gaddafi. They had all of those skills. They were battle-hardened. They took them to Syria. They threw their lot in with the Islamic State. They helped the Islamic State take Raqqa and set that up as its de facto capital. And very quickly, that became a two-way street. So Libya became the southern compass point for the Islamic State in their de facto caliphate. And we saw a circulation of fighters, not just from here in Libya to Syria, but also to Iraq and all points in between. Of course, we also know that Libyans can still travel to the UK. Not directly. They have to go via Istanbul or they have to go via Tunis, but they can get there. We're getting very conflicting reports in terms of where Salman Abedi's family may have been from within the country, but certainly it's possible that he was if he was part of a wider militant network, that he could have been part of that great Islamic State circulation which has been taking place.
That was Quentin Somerville in Libya. Stockholm is another city that has suffered Islamist terror attacks, and it's preparing to host the Manchester United match against Ajax in the Europa League final. The Manchester United manager, Jose Mourinho, has expressed his sadness over the bombing. He said he and the world-famous club, which has millions of supporters globally, had the victims and their families in their minds and hearts as they were preparing for the match. Nick Garnett reports from the Swedish capital.
This was supposed to be the culmination of Manchester United's football season for the club and for the fans. They'd followed the team all over Europe, and tonight's final was supposed to be their chance to cap the season off with a European title until the bomb attack. Many fans, like June Coulter, only found out what happened when their planes landed in the Swedish capital early yesterday morning.
We've come out here to enjoy ourselves, obviously, to go to a match with Man United, and those people went out to have a good time, and some of them will never go home, and we really felt very, very upset about it. We can't get it out of our minds.
For the most part, last night was a solemn affair. Many fans didn't go out drinking, preferring to stay at their hotels. Stockholm was a fairly quiet place. I met a group of men from Manchester as they sat at an empty bar table. They were all thinking about what had happened back home.
It's horrible, and I couldn't believe it. And I cried in the car, and I don't know people who were there.
Do you want to be here tonight?
No, I don't want to be here tonight. I didn't want to come. You're just getting messages, or I've been getting messages all day. Look after yourself, but it's them that's been targeted. It's Manchester, it's not Stockholm, is it?
If we can't get drunk, enjoy ourselves, we can't take pictures of ourselves, enjoying ourselves in nice scenic view, we can't do that and send them on to Manchester. We just can't do it. We don't want to be here. We just don't want to be here.
There was some singing and drinking, but even then they had one eye back on events in Manchester.
It's subdued, everything's subdued, everything is. I've had my wife phone me today, asked me to come home, to keep her family safe.
What we won't do as a nation is fall to these people. All we can say here is, Manchester United support, our thoughts are with these families.
I feel guilty by being over there. I think I should be home with them, and they're not really close friends, as associates, but it was a bad day for the world and a bad day for Manchester.
Even the Ajax fans realise that football has to be secondary to events in Britain. I've worked in Manchester for most of my life. My family were at the arena last week. We were supposed to be going back there this Saturday. It's overshadowed events here in Stockholm completely. As one man said to me, how do you celebrate, even if United win, when Manchester's children lie dead and injured back home?
That report from Stockholm by Nick Garnett. On to other news now. The top court in Taiwan has ruled that same-sex marriage should become legal. This was the jubilant reaction outside the court when the announcement was made. The court declared that the current civil code, which says marriage can only be between a man and a woman, is unconstitutional and must be amended within 2 years. Our correspondent Cindy Sue was outside the Parliament building in Taipei when the ruling was made.
It's very good news for them because basically the court is saying that the current laws are unconstitutional. So therefore, they must be amended within 2 years to allow same-sex couples to get married and to protect them under the marriage laws. So now, the only thing that's unclear is that the court doesn't say exactly how far this should go. So it's up to the Parliament to decide whether to grant same-sex couples equal rights as heterosexual couples in everything, including adoptions, inheritance, making decisions on each other's medical issues and emergencies, in everything that heterosexual couples are protected by under the marriage law, or whether they would simply create a separate law that would allow same-sex couples to get married but not grant them equal rights in all matters.
Is there a lot of opposition to this in Taiwan, or is there a feeling of acceptance there now?
There is a feeling of acceptance because Taiwan is one of the most liberal places in the world. Each year, there's a huge Asia's biggest gay pride parade is held here. And at last count, it attracted 80,000 people, not only from Taiwan, but elsewhere in Asia. And just to give you a sense of how unusual Taiwan is, in many countries in Asia, being homosexual is still a crime. And it's still punishable by whipping, caning, and stoning even. And, even in places like Japan and Korea, which are democracies and more liberal compared to others like India or Pakistan, they still don't have the laws in place to prevent discrimination in the workplace and in education. But Taiwan already have these laws in place. And so Taiwan is in many ways leading Asia. And if this becomes law, if same-sex marriage becomes legalized, it'll be the first place in Asia to do so. So there is widespread acceptance here.
That was Cindy Su in Taipei. So Taiwan is moving towards legalising gay marriage. But what about the rest of Asia? Here's our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow.
Following on from what Cindy said there, it's a mixed picture across Asia over the last few decades. As everybody knows, economies in that part of the world have developed very quickly, but societies haven't changed quite as quick. Some places like Taiwan are at the vanguard. They're very open, liberal, democratic. Other places, traditionalists and conservatives have been holding back that tide. So, for example, just today in South Korea, a army captain was given a 6-month suspended prison sentence for having sex with another serviceman, whilst homosexuality is not illegal for civilians in South Korea, it is for people in the military. And there's definitely a conservative tide there. And in other places, actually, they're going in the opposite direction. So Cindy also indicated there caning in the Indonesian province of Aceh. Just yesterday, 2 men were caned, given 80 lashes each for having sex with each other. So that law only came in the last couple of years. So really a mixed picture. Some places going forward, progressive, other places going in the opposite direction.
That was Michael Bristow, our Asia-Pacific editor. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And remember that every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week. The programme's also available to download from our website. They are leaders with starkly different world views, and the first meeting between President Trump and Pope Francis has taken place at the Vatican. It's part of Mr. Trump's first foreign trip as US President. Our correspondent Jenny Hill was in Rome when President Trump arrived, and she spoke to Valerie Sanderson about the encounter.
I don't think anyone really expected this to be a great meeting of minds. One, of course, is a billionaire who doesn't much like immigrants. The other is a man who rejects the wealthy trappings of a luxury lifestyle and welcomes refugees. As you say, Mr. Trump and Pope Francis have clashed in the past very publicly over Mr. Trump's plans to build a wall on the Mexican border. But, for all that, and perhaps just for the cameras today, this appeared to be a pretty cordial meeting. Mr. Trump looked a little uncomfortable at times, but he was accompanied by his wife Melania, his daughter Ivanka, both of whom dressed traditionally, wearing black veils over their faces, and it all appeared to go really rather well. The Pope blessed Melania Trump's rosary. There was the traditional exchange of presents, although this was rather interesting. The President gave the Pope a collection of Martin Luther King's writings. In return, and bear in mind their very different positions on environmental policy, the Pope presented Mr. Trump with a treatise he wrote 2 years ago on climate change, in which he warned about the future and very specifically blamed man for climate change. So read into that what you will.
Mm-hmm. Was there any awkwardness, or did you sense it was quite good chemistry?
I don't think chemistry is what anyone was expecting. You didn't really see that. We're told by reporters who were present that right at the end of the private meeting, we don't, of course, really know what was said between the two men, but that Donald Trump reportedly said to the Pope, "I'll remember what you've told me." There was a lot of talk about world peace and so on. Among those present, the Pope gave Mr. Trump a medallion with an olive tree on it, for example. A lot of this, I think, was for appearance's sake.
And later today, of course, Jenny, President Trump flies to Brussels, doesn't he? I mean, what does the EU and NATO want out of that visit?
Well, there's a lot on the table, isn't there? My goodness. The EU and NATO are both very nervous about what the American administration is going to make of Russia, sanctions, the Iranian nuclear deal and so on. But I think first and foremost, what the EU and what NATO want from this first meeting with Donald Trump is to really impress upon him, in their view, the importance of the organisations. You'll recall, of course, that on the campaign trail, Donald Trump referred to NATO as obsolete. It's a statement he's rode back on since he's been in office. He showed initially, again, on the campaign trail, a similar disregard, really, for the EU. And I know that there is a sense, certainly in Berlin, where I spend a lot of my time, that there is a concern that Mr. Trump doesn't really understand the workings of the EU or its significance on the world stage, and certainly its leaders are very keen to impress upon him the need to do business with it as a bloc as opposed to individual countries.
Jenny Hill in Rome. And as we heard there are many issues on which these two leaders disagree, but there is one point of common ground they might share. Our Rome correspondent James Reynolds explains.
Among his many titles and possessions, Pope Francis owns one rather impressive object, which I'm bashing semi-politely: his own personal border wall. It protects his Vatican mini-state on three sides, and it's the kind of wall, perhaps, that President Trump might envy. It's guarded, fortified, and it even has openings from which you can fire a bow and arrow. So might this Vatican wall make a good basis for the planned US-Mexico border wall? I asked an expert, Carla Cappiello, the head of the Rome Engineers Association.
It would definitely be an inspiration in terms of its structure, maybe not so much on the methods used to build it and the materials used. Technology has moved on, but it still was very innovative for its time.
Do you know how much in the line? 16 euro. Ticket touts standing at the base of the Vatican wall offer their tours. This particular section of the wall, the most imposing, was designed by Michelangelo. If you're going to build a border wall, you might as well have one of the greatest minds in history design it for you. I approached some American tourists, and they appeared to know what I was going to ask.
Oh, and you found the Americans for border walls.
Yeah.
Okay.
Build the wall. No, I'm just
Build
kidding.
the wall.
I'm kidding.
Make America great again.
Stop. We don't believe that. We're kidding.
What do you think about this wall?
I like it. It's tall.
I feel like it'd be easy to climb, though. It should be straight up.
Do you think the United States should use this model for its border wall with Mexico?
Yes. Yeah.
For the record, we don't believe in building a wall in America, and we think that that's a really silly idea.
I don't know if this would be more expensive, though, than the wall that's already designed. Well, I don't think it's in the budget, though.
I think we'll probably hire Mexican labor to build the wall.
No. Aren't they paying for it?
A person who thinks only about building walls and not building bridges is not Christian, Francis said last year. And the Pope makes it clear that he prefers bridges. His Twitter handle even carries the old Roman title Pontifex, or Great Bridge Builder. A point of real significance, says Vatican watcher Robert Mickens.
Pope Francis takes this title very seriously. The principles that he tries to apply are encounter, dialogue, and accompaniment, and that means walking together. What you see, he'll meet any religious or political leader without putting preconditions. He's not calculating a win or loss situation. It's first, let's encounter each other, and then we move by steps in increment.
Donald Trump may build his border wall, but the US president may struggle to match some of the Pope's own emergency planning. In front of me, there is an extra section of the Vatican wall, the Passetto, or passageway. It's a medieval papal escape route. In case the city's invaded, or the Pope gets into trouble, he's meant to run from his home in St. Peter's through this passageway to safety in a castle next to the Tiber River. Every wall owner, surely, needs a getaway plan.
That was James Reynolds in Rome. Myanmar has pardoned more than 250 prisoners ahead of peace talks that began today between several ethnic groups and representatives of the government and army. The aim of the discussions is to end more than 5 decades of civil war. The country's leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has defended her government's sporadic attempts to resolve the conflict between the military and a range of rebel groups. Jonah Fisher is the BBC correspondent in Yangon.
The big goal is to achieve an ethnic peace settlement with all of Myanmar's many ethnic groups that have, give or take, been fighting the central government and the Burmese army here for most of the last 50 years. I think the realistic goal for this meeting that's opened this morning is simply for all the key players to show up. It looks like a last-minute intervention from the Chinese government is going to make that a possibility. They've used their leverage on some of the rebel groups who are active along the border with China. I don't think anyone is expecting real substantive progress. This is just seen as something of a step forward to try and get everyone in the same place. It's crucial. If this country is going to take a step forward and develop economically, particularly in those border areas where Myanmar borders China and where Myanmar borders Thailand, there will have to be a peace agreement in place that allows development to take place. So on a simple human level, if there's no peace, there will be no real development in those areas. There is another equation in place here. The Burmese army is very powerful politically still, and they have really made it a precondition of stepping back from politics, that there is a peace agreement with all of these many ethnic rebel groups. So that's in the back of everyone's mind too, that only if they can get a peace agreement in place with all these different rebel groups will the Burmese army think about stepping back from politics here.
Jonah Fisher in Yangon. The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, says martial law on the island of Mindanao could last for up to a year, following clashes between the army and militants linked to Islamic State. It's a significant extension of the 60 days originally declared and gives the military increased power. It's only the second time martial law, which allows the detention of people for long periods without charge, has been imposed in the Philippines since the fall of President Marcos in 1986. And Mr. Duterte said he wouldn't rule out placing the entire country under martial law if the threat posed by IS increases. Our Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head reports.
In his characteristically brash and unpredictable manner, President Duterte has for months blown hot and cold about declaring martial law, alternately threatening to impose it, then stating it would be counterproductive. Now he's officially announced martial law, it is not countrywide to address the drug problem, as he had previously suggested, but only in the southern island of Mindanao, where troops are battling a fringe Islamic group known as the Maute Group for control of the city of Marawi. Under the martial law provisions, the army will take control of security there and have greater powers to stop and detain people. Mr. Duterte is the first president from Mindanao and had promised that finding a lasting peace on the island would be a top priority of his administration. But the conflict, involving a bewildering array of armed groups, some pledging allegiance to the so-called Islamic State, is complex and deep-rooted. Solutions have eluded previous governments, and it's not clear that President Duterte's reliance on martial law will prove any more successful.
That was Jonathan Head. Now, why do flamingos prefer standing on one leg? Biologists at Emory University in Atlanta say they now have part of the answer. Lena Ting is one of the researchers involved in the study, and she spoke to the BBC's Connie Sharp.
What we were able to show is that it's biomechanically possible for the flamingos to stand and even sleep on one leg with very little muscle effort. And that's interesting because for humans, that's the opposite of what we experience when we stand on one leg, right? It's harder for us to do that and we wobble more. Whereas in the flamingos, they actually wobble less when they're standing on one leg.
So are they using less energy then by just using this one leg? And is that why they're doing it?
Well, we don't have a direct measure of the energy that they are expending, but we do have both behavioral evidence to show that they're probably not making as many corrections of balance when they're standing, and that even in the absence of muscle activity in the animal, that they're able to adopt a stable posture. So all of this evidence suggests that yes, flamingos probably don't expend as much energy when they're standing on one leg, perhaps not as much as they do when standing on two legs even.
That is an incredible revelation, because previously it was thought, wasn't it, that they're standing on one leg to reduce muscle fatigue?
So that's an interesting hypothesis. So if it's fatiguing to stand on one leg and you have to shift from one to the other, then that would suggest that it actually does take effort to stand on one leg. Our study suggests that it actually takes them less energy to stand on one leg than on two legs.
And tell us about this passive gravitational stay mechanism. Why is it described as this? Because that's the term being used to describe the perfect balance as they stand on one leg?
Imagine that you're squatting or doing a yoga pose, like a chair posture.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way that the flamingo's anatomy is arranged when it's standing. The thigh is horizontal and the lower leg is vertical, and that's the part that you actually see. You can't see the thigh. And so what happens is when gravity is engaged and let's say they lose their muscle tone, then the body falls forward onto the thigh, and something about the anatomy allows that knee to stay at a right angle and to support all of the body weight in a very stable posture without the need to activate muscles.
So now you know. That was Lena Ting of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and she was speaking to Carney Sharp. And that's it from us for now, but I'll have an updated version of the Global News podcast for you later. If you'd like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. We like to hear from you. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard. Until next time, goodbye.